I think he's setting the standard right here, the righteousness of God's law. And this is consistent throughout the Bible. Don't hate your neighbor. And if you do, he says you're in great, great danger. So here's the question for us. Is there anybody here this morning that you're hating? In other words, is there anybody there that you're in bitterness towards, you're angry with? Then I'm pleading with you to deal with it based on this text. All right, if you will, turn me to Deuteronomy 19. Picking up the reading to verse 1. When the Lord your God has cut off the nation whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them and dwell in their cities and in their houses, you shall separate 3 cities for yourself in the midst of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall prepare roads for yourself and divide into 3 parts the territory of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, that the manslayer may flee there. And this is the case of the manslayer who flees there, that he may live. Whoever kills his neighbor unintentionally, not having hated him in time past, as when a man goes to the woods with the neighbor to cut timber, and his hand swings a stroke with the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies. He shall flee to one of these cities and live. Lest the avenger of blood, while his anger is hot, pursue the manslayer and overtake him. Because the way is long, and kill him, though he was not deserving of death, since he had not hated the victim in times past. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall separate 3 cities for yourself. Now if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he swore to your fathers, and gives you the land which he promised to give to your fathers, and if you keep all these commandments and do them, which I command you to do this day, to love the Lord your God, walk in his ways, walk always in his ways, then you shall add 3 more cities for yourself besides these 3, lest innocent blood be shed in the midst of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and thus guilt of bloodshed be upon you. But if anyone hates his neighbor, lies in wait for him, rises against him, and strikes him mortally, so that he dies, and he flees to one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and bring him from there, and deliver him over to the hand of the avenger of blood, that he may die. Your eye shall not pity him, but you shall put away the guilt of the innocent blood, or put away the innocent blood from Israel, that it may go well with you. All right, our text today, as we continue to study Deuteronomy, we're going to look at chapter 19. And in this text, we're now entering into a new section of the book of Deuteronomy. So when we come to Deuteronomy 19, starting in verse 1, all the way to chapter 26, verse 19, is a new section. And this section, this larger section, is basically in the structure of the 10 Commandments. If you remember, let me back up. When we started in chapter 12, verse 1, all of that really goes to the end of chapter 26, verse 19. What I mean by that is that when we started in chapter 12, we saw this outlaying of the 10 Commandments. In chapter 12, verse 1, all the way to chapter 14, verse 29, we had commandments, we had teachings, case laws that dealt with the worship of God, the first table of the law. And so those are an expansion of the first 3 of the 10 Commandments. Then in chapter 15, verse 1, all the way through chapter 16, verse 17, we had this enumeration of all these holy festivals that were to be kept in Israel. And that would be analogous to the 4th commandment. In other words, God, in the 4th commandment, God establishes the time of worship, the Sabbath day, the festivals that would go with that Sabbath day. And remember, when we looked at the 4th commandment, we looked at these festivals, I think a large problem that many people have with dealing with the Lord's Day, as our confession teaches, is that they confuse these ceremonial aspects that are attached to the 4th commandment that have been done away with when Christ comes upon the scene. Those festivals, those ceremonial celebrations are no longer binding, but the 4th commandment still is. God still desires His people to meet with Him one day, give a day, have a day of rest where they focus their attention in both private, our confession talks about both private and public confession. So a lot of people don't do that in this area. A lot of people will say, well, from 10 to 12, or some of them don't even want to go that long, so from 11 to 11:45, that's my Lord's Day. And then the rest of the day is structured around what they want to do, not what God has called them to do. And a lot of people look at, well, that just sounds miserable. Well, if you think being in the presence of God, spending time to get to know Him, worship Him, and drawing closer to Him is miserable, let me just say this, you're going to hate heaven. You're going to hate eternity because that's what it's all about. So now, today is just really, this is probably a horrible way to say it, but a dry run for eternity. Today should be a sweet day for the Christian. Amen. For the true Christian who's been bought by Christ, this ought to be a sweet day where, look, the person who comes to me and says, look, I want to do what I want to do the rest of this day, and how dare you look, it's not about me telling you what to do. God's Word says, separate this day. 6 days you can do your lawful works, recreations, whatever it is. But on this day, I want to spend this day with you. So, that challenges us to think, how are you structuring this day to be with the Lord? Now, a lot of people unfortunately come in here and they say, okay, well, I don't really have a good answer for you about the way you just described it. I kind of sound like a jerk if I say I don't want to spend time with God. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away a lot of things out of my life on this day. But you don't fill it with anything. It's not a do-nothing day, but it's to be purposed. Your activities should be structured around drawing closer to Him. And that can take various forms. You know, there's been times in this church where we spent, even, I know y'all think this day is long, but it used to even be longer. It used to be really long, where we would spend more time doing character sketches or even just worshiping, singing. There's a lot of things we would do to try to structure the day to make it beneficial to our soul. But if you go home, that's fine. But what are you doing with that day? And a lot of times we punish our children and say, well, you can't do any of these things that we used to do, but you don't fill it with anything. You know what that becomes? It becomes a miserable day for the child. So the day takes planning. It takes structure. So think about it ahead of time. All right, let me keep moving. We just finished the third section of this last week, where we saw the presentation of the civil and the religious government, that God has appointed leaders for Israel in the civil and in the church realm. And so that really is analogous to the fifth commandment, in that the fifth commandment deals with all God-ordained authority. And so today we're going to begin with chapter 19 all the way to chapter 26:19. We're going to have different case laws, and these statutes correspond to the second half of the Decalogue, the second table of the law, how we treat fellow man. So commandments 6 through 10 are going to be dealt with from chapter 19 all the way to chapter 26. But here we see the extent, the reach of the covenant law and the commandments. Commandments 6 through 10. And so accordingly, the first part that we're going to deal with today is concerned with the righteousness of the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder. And so I want you to see here, Deuteronomy 19, verse 1, all the way to Deuteronomy 21, verse 9, if you're taking notes, is concerned with the righteousness of the sixth commandment. And it follows these topics. Number one, we're going to see today the cities of refuge and the manslayer. That's our text today. So we're going to deal with that today. Number two, next week we'll look at the moving of a man's landmark in verse 14. And that's an interesting position of the law, of that law. And I'll try to discuss next week why I believe that fits in this section of the sixth commandment. Then number three, we have the punishment of false witnesses. So when you falsely testify, what does God's law say about that? We've gotten comfortable with perjurers in this land, bringing false testimonies, but God's law speaks heavily against that. And then in chapter 20, we're going to see how do we conduct war. I think that fits very nicely with the sixth commandment, and I think we need to, with all the warmongering that's been going on for the past 25 years in this country, we need to have a biblical view about war. And then we'll conclude this section with the case of an unsolved murder in chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. All right, so you can kind of start seeing how these case laws are actually tying to the Ten Commandments. And so the law we're going to study today is on the manslayer and the cities of refuge. And this law is revealed in the context of the Old Covenant. It speaks in terms of Israel, the land of Canaan. But we need to study study these case laws in light of the sixth commandment. I think it speaks to us. Again, the sixth commandment is thou shalt not kill. And so what we're doing here is we're studying the cities of refuge, the manslayer. All this is based on the unchanging moral character of God. So we can't just say, well, this is only to Israel, because God really has a high value of image bearers of God, and that when we kill an image bearer of God or murder one, right, that's an assault on the image of God. And so He takes that very highly, and we'll see that here in just a moment. But don't just limit the authority of this passage to the Old Covenant. So when we're studying the Old Testament, we got to discern the theology that underlies these commands and then see how that eternal truth applies to us in the New Covenant. And that's what we'll be trying to do today. Now, in general, the theological basis for this text that we're going to be studying here today on the manslayer and the cities of refuge is twofold. Number one, man is made in the image of God, and therefore a man or a woman's life is exceedingly precious and valuable. That's an important theological basis because that doesn't change in the New Covenant. Number two is that God is the God of justice who will have the guilty punished and the innocent protected. So what this law does, chapter 19, this case law does here, is it protects human life and it seeks to ensure justice among men. In other words, if you think about it, what it's doing is it's expanding the righteousness of the Sixth Commandment by making a distinction between murder and accidental killings. It puts in place certain things to make sure that there's a crucial distinction. This distinction needs to be honored and practiced within the judicial sphere. So we need to remember as we study the passage today, Moses is preaching to the nation of Israel prior to his own death. In other words, he's preparing them for the time when they cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan. And so when he does this, it's almost like a sermon. When he's doing this, he's already assuming previous revelation on this subject. God has already given them earlier revelation in Genesis. We'll look at that. Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. He's written down. He has taught Israel about this subject of murder, manslaughter, and the cities of refuge. So, for example, in Genesis 9, 5 through 6, he says, and surely, this is when Noah and them get off the ark, and surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man. The hand of every man's brother will I require the life of a man. Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? Because or for in the image of God made he man. Now that's assumed. That teaching is assumed here in Deuteronomy 19. Another important passage that Moses is relying upon is Exodus 21, 12 through 14, and Numbers 35, 9 through 23. I don't have time to go back and read all those for you, but I would encourage you particularly go back and look at Numbers 35, 9 through 23. These are parallel passages about the subject of the cities of refuge and the manslayer and this character called the Avenger of Blood. Now, this teaching on the cities of refuge and the manslayer is divided into three parts. First of all, we see the necessity of Israel to provide these cities of refuge, the provision. So, actually, there's two parts to this passage separated by an intervening verses that deal with this, and I'm joining them together for the purpose of our study today. First of all, he talks about three cities that are to be established after they've completed the initial stage of their conquest. That's verses 1 through 3. Then he furthermore speaks about three more cities that will need to be added after they've received a full inheritance in the future. That's what verses 7 through 9 is talking about. And then he talks about the reasons for these cities. They're to be places where every manslayer can flee. They're to be established. Why? To prevent the shedding of innocent blood. Okay? The second section of this law deals with the case of accidental homicide. Now, I'm using the word homicide. That's the very basic meaning of killing a man. When I use the word homicide, I'm not necessarily saying it's criminal homicide. Often when you hear this word homicide, you think murder. But that's not what we're equating here. The word homicide simply means to kill a man. And so this is a case law of an accidental killing of a man. And that's verses 4 to 6. And then in verses 11 through 13, we have another case. That's deliberate homicide. And that case law is set forth for us here to consider. Okay? So that's how we're going to look at this. So let's look at this. In verses 1 through 3, in verses 7 through 10, we have the provision for these cities of refuge. Now, earlier in Numbers 35, 9 through 15, Moses commanded Israel to set aside 6 cities of refuge. 3 on the east side of the Jordan, that is before they come over the Jordan into Canaan. Remember, we've already looked at this in Deuteronomy, but they conquered the land of the Amorites on the east side. They divided that amongst some tribes there in that region. But 3 cities were to be set aside on the east side of the Jordan. Also, when they come into the land of Canaan, 3 more cities were to be established. That's on the western side of the river. Interesting, in Numbers 35:6, it's stated that these cities of refuge were to be among the cities that had been given to the Levites. And then in Deuteronomy 4:41 through 43, if you'll look back at that, verses 41 through 43, you remember we talked about this briefly, but in Moses' historical summary of that, what he had done, what God had done for the people, and here we have a note of this. We see that Moses brought these three cities, or separated three cities on that side of the Jordan facing the sunrise. So that would be the east side of the Jordan. They were in the plains of Moab. They're not yet in Canaan in Deuteronomy 4. But Moses is not going to be allowed to go into Canaan himself. He's about to die. So God says he can't go in. And so here he's charging them to fulfill the commandment that was given in Numbers 35. Make sure when you get into the land, you separate these three cities after completing the initial stage of the conquest. So this repetitive repeating of these cities of refuge tells me that this is important to God to establish justice in the land and to prevent innocent blood from being shed in the land. Make note of that, because shedding of innocent blood is very problematic to a holy God. Now, the way it's stated here in Deuteronomy, the way he starts off Deuteronomy 19, it's really a statement of faith. It's not as if the Lord He might give you these nations, but basically the way it's stated is, when He does this, it's going to happen, right? When He does this, He talks constantly here about God cutting them off and about the land that God promised to give them. God is going to overthrow these nations. It's going to happen. Israel, you will take possession. And so Moses is exhorting them, since this is going to happen, this is the great work I'm going to give you. When I give you this land, here's what I want you to do. I want you to set aside these cities in the midst of Canaan for these purposes. 3 cities there. He also says in verse 3, after you've set these cities apart in the midst of the land, you're to prepare a way. In other words, make it easy. Prepare a way. Make sure these roads leading to these cities of refuge are clear. They're clearly marked. They're taken care of, so that the person who is fleeing to the city of refuge is not going to have any hindrance to get there. Make sure they're accessible. Designate the cities. Make sure the way to them is plain. Very important. Anyone who needs to find their way to the city, they could find it. He also says you're to divide the coast of your land into 3 parts. This means these cities are to be equally spaced throughout the land. Divide 3 districts. And so these cities are going to be placed strategically in each district, so that whenever anyone dwells in the land, there will be a city of refuge that's relatively close by. Now down in verse 7 through 9, jumping down there real quick, he returns to this command. In verse 7, wherefore I command you, saying, you shall separate 3 cities for you. That's the original command that he just gave them in verse 2. But he also looks to the future and says, and if the Lord God will enlarge your coast as you sworn unto your fathers, and as to the forefathers. Notice, he says, in the future, when this is given, you're going to bring 3 more cities on board. Okay? So we have these instructions of all these cities. But what's interesting to me here is that, and it's pretty basic, in verse 9, remember this is Moses preaching. This is not just legal text. This is an exhortation. This is instruction. This is teaching. Yes, it's legal, and there's legal principles here, and those things are important. But notice throughout how Moses is always exhorting the people, and very fundamentals of in the very structure and the very fundamentals of covenant law. God made a covenant. God gives statutes and conditions to the covenant, and He's saying part of you honoring the covenant is to establish these cities. It's very important that you do this. And these commandments here, He says, if you keep all these commandments and do them, you'll be blessed. He notice here, keep all the commandments. Love the Lord your God. Walk always in His ways. In other words, the state of the heart towards God is essential. Again, if you're going to see fulfillment of God's purpose in your life, you must love Him. Can we agree with that? That shouldn't be very controversial. You must love the Lord. And this is a great commandment of the law that we studied earlier in Deuteronomy 6:5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. In fact, this particular commandment is stated 9 times in Deuteronomy. God's law and the preaching of the law of Moses is set forth not in some legalistic system. It's a system of love. It's a system of relationship with God. People have been redeemed by His grace. This means they have surrendered their lives to Him, and they're going to walk in faithfulness to His covenant commandments. Do Do you see that? Again, it's tied. Keeping the commands of God is tied to your love. How do you demonstrate you love God? Well, Jesus tells you in the New Testament, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. The commandments are not burdensome. The commandments are holy, just, and good. And if you want to have a relationship with God, right, when you're redeemed, don't think I've been saved so that now I can just live and break His law. That just demonstrates you hate Him. To live in defiance with His commands is a demonstration of not your love, but your hate. I don't know how you get around this in Deuteronomy. For those who tell you, I don't know why your church is studying Deuteronomy, all that legalistic law-keeping stuff. They haven't read Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says this is how you love God. So, based on the history of Israel and what we see in the Old Testament text, do they love Him or hate Him? Now, there was a remnant that loved Him, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, you had glimpses of where they obeyed God, and they demonstrated their love to Him by obeying Him, but a large part of Israel's history was them demonstrating their hatred towards God and being punished for it. Something we shouldn't take lightly. The word love, as we pointed out in chapter 6, verse 5, same word that's here, it's a relational term. It refers to a genuine love and affection for another person. It's used of a love of a husband and his wife, or a wife for her husband. The word literally means to long for something. And within the context of a relationship, it means to love someone in the same sense you long for their company, you long for their companionship. In other words, you delight in someone. That's the idea of the word. And so to love God is to delight in Him, to long for Him, to want to be in His presence, to fellowship with Him, to walk with Him. Does that describe you today? Do you long to be in His presence, to be with Him? Like, it's easy to go back and Monday morning quarterback here in Deuteronomy and say, boy, what did the children of Israel, what was wrong with them? But I don't think that's why the text is preserved for us. I think the text is preserved for us to examine our own hearts. Do I love Him? Do I want to be with Him? Okay? To walk refers to how you live. It's the manner of life you choose. It's how you conduct yourself. The command is to walk ever in His ways, every day, at all times. So this command is repeated 8 times in the book of Deuteronomy. And that's really the theme, isn't it? Keep God's commandments. The foundation of that really starts with your heart. Do you, when I say your heart, I'm saying with your whole being, do you truly love God? If you do, then it's going to manifest itself in how you respond when He tells you to do something or tells you not to do something. If your heart truly loves Him, you're going to obey Him. Now, Moses also states here in verse 3 and in verse 10, the reason these cities are to be provided. They're to prevent something. Verse 3, they're to provide a place for the manslayer to flee for safety as he awaits trial. And they're to prevent what? The shedding of innocent blood. Now, in verse 3 it says, the manslayer may flee there. And if you got the King James, the authorized version, it says thither. If that sounds better to you, then you can use that word. But that's why we have these cities, that every slayer may flee thither. Now, the word slayer here refers to the act of someone who commits the act of homicide. Now, that homicide could be criminal, it could be non-criminal in nature, but it's the very word used in the 6th commandment that says you shall not kill. There we discussed it pretty extensively, if you remember, a while back. But when we looked at the meaning of the 6th commandment by way of review, let me say some things here. What we studied back in the 6th commandment, this word for kill, this word translated here, slayer, is used 47 times in the Hebrew Bible. And it means literally to break or to dash in pieces. And therefore it was used as an act of killing, for murder, for slaying. Now, 46 of those 47 times in the Bible is used in regard to one man killing another man. There's only one time that it's not in reference to a man killing a man, and that's in Proverbs 23:13, where it says, the slothful man says, there's a lion without, I shall be slain in the streets. That's the only time the word's used in reference to a person, something other than a person killing another person. But none of the usages of this killing refer to the killing of anything like an animal for food or for sacrifice, or killing even in warfare. This particular word is not used in those contexts. It's not used, 24 times it refers to murder, which is wicked. In other words, when I say murder, I'm talking about the deliberate taking of another person's life through an outburst of anger as premeditated. 20 times it's used in reference to manslaughter, specifically to the slayer who accidentally kills his neighbor. And one time to the avenger of blood who kills the man, the slayer. Now, one time to the execution of a murderer, and that both of those would be found in Numbers 35. So when you talk about the avenger of blood who kills the manslayer and the execution of a murderer, that's used in Numbers 35, those two examples. And so we see this word slayer covers any act of homicide where one person kills another person by any means for any reason. It could be deliberate, it could be accidental. And so when it says that every slayer may flee there, this means that anyone who killed another person in Israel. So if you're in warfare and you have to kill someone in battle, this doesn't apply to you. But within the course of life, if you killed another person in Israel, they had the right to flee to one of these cities of refuge as the first step in resolving this issue. The first step in the legal process was for them, the manslayer, to flee to this city of refuge. There, the nature of the act could be determined, whether or not the person was guilty of murder or not. We also learn from the text, this text, and from the Numbers passage in Numbers 35, that it was the responsibility of the leaders and the elders and the judges of the city of refuge where the slayer would flee. They, in other words, those judges, those elders were responsible to discern who should be granted sanctuary in the city and who should be executed for murder. And so this kind of underlines one of the primary themes of our text here this morning, and that is that justice is achieved through proper judicial procedure. Protection against, this actually gives us protection from vigilante justice. Every fleer is to flee there. Why? Well, back to verse 6, so that innocent blood should not be shed in your land. Now, the provision of the cities of refuge and the judicial procedure here and in Numbers 35 was intended to protect the person who killed someone accidentally from being put to death by the avenger of blood. And so one of the constant themes in Scriptures is that God hates the shedding of innocent blood. Proverbs 6:17 says this, 6 things God hates, and one of them is hands that shed innocent blood. And so when we see innocent blood being shed in a land, understand you're under the curse of God. God hates this when it's tolerated. Like, it's not as though someone sheds innocent blood and then they're prosecuted for it. He's not talking about that. What he is saying is that when it happens, and then the problem we have in our land is even legislated. It's protected. Like, moms are legally protected in different states. The laws are different, but they're still sanctioned by the government that they can murder their own children. In other words, these laws tell moms when, where, and how to kill their babies with impunity. And so, if there's one thing all churches should be able to agree upon is that God hates this. We shouldn't be silent on it. We shouldn't be duped into saying, well, this is a political issue. No, it's a moral issue. And when that innocent blood is polluting the land, that land will vomit you out. You're under God's curse. So think about this. It teaches us that one of the things I want you to see with the 6th commandment and what we saw in Genesis 9 is it teaches that you and I, we're to hold human life in the highest regard. Why? Because we're image bearers of God. We're always to be thinking, how should we act so that human life will be protected? Another way to think about it is, we should never be acting recklessly or foolishly. We should never put one in danger. You know, the Christian man and woman is always be thinking of safety towards another, to protect them from injury, protect them from death. So we shouldn't act foolishly, recklessly, so that we would endanger human life. And so we think about these laws that we're studying here today. You know, human life is exceedingly valuable to God. We're made in His image. And so human life should be exceedingly valuable to us. All of it. That should be the goal of our lives, is to protect, defend innocent life. And that's the basis that underlies, this is the theology that underlies this passage. Innocent blood should not be shed in your land. Now, that should grab our attention when we think about, in terms of our land, the shedding of innocent blood here. Because God's great concern, can you see here? God's great concern is that we don't allow it to happen in our land. Now, when you talk to your conservative legislators who claim to be Christian, but yet they're okay with these laws, well, we reduce the amount of shedding of innocent blood. Certainly God is going to pat us on the back. No. You're tolerating innocent blood in the land. You made it legal to do this. God's not going to bless you at all. He's not going to pat you on the back at all. Because this thing says, I don't want any innocent blood shed in the land. It's not saying I want less of it. I don't want any of it. Now, continue with our study here. And let me just say this. When you think of innocent blood in the land, shed in the land, always think pollution. The land is polluted. And when the land is polluted, it comes under the curse of God, not the blessing of God. You say, well, I think we're blessed. Well, then you need to take your blinders off. We're not being blessed right now. Your wealth is being eroded through excessive taxation, through currency devaluation, through debt being raised up more and more and more with all these wars that we're creating everywhere we go, right? Think about how one of the big pushes on the conservative side is we've got to do something with illegal immigration. But do you understand it's not the illegal immigrants that caused the problem to begin with. They're a symptom of a problem. Right? So when we talk about these gang members that cross the border who like to rape and pillage and do all kinds of things, well, why do they come over here and do it? Because we tolerate it. See, it's the lawlessness of this land that they are okay with. We've demonstrated that, we don't care. When I say we don't care, they may slap a rapist on the wrist, but they don't punish them the way they should be punished. Because if you punish rapists the way the Bible says you should punish rapists or pedophiles or sex traffickers or those who kill babies, if you did things biblically, they would go find somewhere else to practice their trade. Oh, those people are serious. Do you see the difference there? So we think if we got rid of all the illegals, all of our crime would go away, and I would say it wouldn't. Because the crime was already there that made these criminals feel safe in our land to begin with. Why? Because we don't believe what we're reading here in Deuteronomy 19. All right, let's continue our study. Let's move to point 2. The case of accidental homicide is given in verses 4 through 6. 2 types of homicide are presented in our text today. The first we're going to look at in verses 4 to 6. The second is in verses 11 to 13. The first one we're going to call accidental homicide. Now, before we look at these, I want to remind you that these are not only the kinds of homicide that are delineated by the law of God, but they are the 2 considered here. But they're not the only categories of homicide in the law of God. Other important categories in the Scriptures, the law, that we might call reckless or negligent homicide that we've seen in the past, where we don't take care of a dangerous situation. For example, in Exodus 21, there's another kind of homicide that maybe you need to think about. In Exodus 21, there's a man who has a very dangerous ox. He's known to gore and push at people, but he doesn't restrain it. Though he knew the ox is dangerous, if that ox kills someone, then that man is liable for murder. And so we would call that negligent or reckless homicide, not deliberate nor accidental, but it's homicide based on recklessness or gross negligence. So there's other categories that are not dealt with here this morning, but nevertheless they are dealt with in the law of God. Now, when we come to this, we're going to present legal terminology, justifiable homicide. That's given to you in Exodus 22, 2 through 3. We've seen a case of that in Exodus 22, 2 through 3 that deals with the danger posed by an intruder who breaks into your home in the middle of the night. The homeowner doesn't know their intention. He doesn't know whether or not they're armed or not, but he sheds blood of that intruder. And Exodus 22 says, well, there's no guilt for doing such a thing. That would be a justifiable homicide. That's another case law that you have to think of, another category that's not presented here, but it is part of God's law. All right, let's come back to Deuteronomy 19. To this particular passage, and let's look at the definition of an accidental homicide that's given in verse 4. Very logical, very well laid out here by Moses. Moses develops this theme in very clear fashion, in my opinion. He begins with the definition of what an accidental homicide is in verse 4. And this is the case of a slayer which shall flee to the city of refuge. Why? So that he may live, and we wouldn't have innocent blood shed in the land. Now, this is a person who can go to the city of refuge, and it will be sanctuary. A sanctuary will be given to him. The second example, beginning in verse 11, that person, if he flees to the city of refuge, but he's found to be guilty of murder, he's not going to live. In that case, he's not going to find safety. He's not going to find protection or sanctuary in the city of refuge. But this is the definition of the kind of manslaying, the kind of homicide that's not criminal here in this first case. It's not reckless. It's not deliberate. This kind of homicide, it does happen, unfortunately, but it does not require blood guiltiness to be upon the head of this person. So how is it defined? It says, who kills his neighbor ignorantly. Number 2, whom he hated not in the past. Those are the 2 conditions. The key word here is ignorant, which means unintentional, unwittingly. That is, they didn't have any knowledge of their action. They didn't know their action would harm or kill someone. They were involved in just a normal everyday activity, as we look at the illustration here, like cutting wood. And so the idea of killing your neighbor ignorantly means accidentally. And an accident is something that was not expected, it was not foreseen, and it was not intended. The legal definition of accidental death today goes something like this: one resulting from an act which is lawful and lawfully done under a reasonable belief that no harm is possible, distinguished from involuntary manslaughter, which is the result of an unlawful act or a lawful act done in a reckless way. Now that's from Black's Law Dictionary. Another legal term to describe accidental killing is what we call homicide by misadventure. And that's defined this way by Black: the accidental killing of another where the slayer is doing the lawful act unaccompanied by any criminally careless or reckless conduct. And I think those 2 legal definitions fit well with this text today. They killed the neighbor ignorantly, and then the illustration that's given in verse 5. Verse 5, the illustration there is someone's doing a lawful act. It's not illegal to cut wood. They're doing a lawful act where there was no intention to harm, no foreseen problem, nothing that anyone could predict. And that's the illustration that's given to us. But look beyond this phrase, who kills his neighbor ignorantly. That's one. And then the second part of this case is whom he hated not in the past. Now that's the second aspect of this definition here. And interestingly, it involves previous relations between 2 people, the man and his victim. And so it's so significant that it's repeated in verse 6 about the avenger of blood, not overtaking this man and killing him. Why? Because he wasn't worthy of death, inasmuch as he hated him not in the past. It's also referenced again in verse 11 in a secondary way, where the murderer is defined as someone who did hate his neighbor. Also, when you get time, look at the parallel text in Numbers 35:23. It describes a similar case. It says that this person was not his enemy. The one that was accidentally killed was not the enemy of the man who killed him. And I think all this is very significant for us to think about. Okay? It indicates 2 things. Number 1, if a person kills someone else and he's been known to hate the person in the past, right? Listen, this is the legal presumption that homicide was intentional. If it is known that you had a grudge, a feud, or a hatred, there's been words, if any altercation between you and the individual that has been killed, the legal presumption in the law of God is that you killed him. Why? Because hatred is the foundation of murder. Murder doesn't come from love. It always comes out of hate. And does this make sense when Jesus says that if you hate your brother in your heart, you've broken the 6th commandment? Now, the second thing this indicates is previous hatred and enmity is admissible in trial. It's an important piece of the evidence in the trial of homicide. So understand this. I think, and we can argue about this one at lunch if you want to, I think this indicates that the biblical standard for 2 or 3 witnesses for conviction of a crime does not necessarily mean an eyewitness to the crime. Here the witnesses will be given testimony of not how the person was killed, but they'll be given testimony, eyewitness testimony to the fact there was previous hatred between you and the person that was killed. In fact, it's a legal presumption here that you are a killer if it can be shown that you are the enemy of this man. That testimony is highly significant in establishing guilt. And so, in this context, it seems to indicate that clear evidence of previous hatred means you're not going to flee to the city of refuge and live. Now, I think this is a weighty point of application for you and I to think of. You may not be planning to go murder someone today, but pay attention to this. Hate is a dangerous thing. Don't let resentment, don't let bitterness, don't let hate build up in your heart. Why? Because it appears that it's the root of many actual murders. And here's the thing. It could be the cause of you being charged someday and convicted of murder when you actually didn't do anything intentionally. Does that make sense? you accidentally kill somebody, but you've had a grudge with them and a feud in the past with them, that testimony could be brought and will be brought to your case. So if you got hatred and a grudge against somebody, be very, very careful with that. Don't let it consume you. I just think we need to think about that because we disconnect these two, and the Bible's bringing the two together. Hatred and murder. Hatred in the past, grudge, feud, altercations, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, you trying to tell me your axe head just accidentally flew off the handle? Right? And just so you know, God's law doesn't give laws to the minutia of every potential accidental death that could happen. It's just an example that wise men could come and say, oh, well, it wasn't that your axe head flew off, but your lawnmower blade flew off the bottom and slung and killed somebody. I'm just making up stuff. Right? But does that make sense? This is very similar to the one in Exodus about your ox goring someone. You say, well, I don't even own an ox. It doesn't matter. What if you got a dog that's been known to hurt people and he gets off and it does some real damage to somebody? You're still liable for that. Okay? Well, likewise, when we come to this case about an axe handle flying off, if it's accidental, that's your story. But there are witnesses that come upon the scene and said, no, I've seen y'all fight and argue quite a bit. That can be used as evidence against you. So, again, make sure... Well, think about what Christ speaks clearly to this. He said, you have heard that it was said of them of old time that you shall not kill, and whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. And what's significant here to me is what Jesus, he's there on the Sermon on the Mount. He's not setting aside the Old Testament law. But I think he's clearing away the scribal misinterpretations. He's given the truth of the nature of the law. So when you've read, and what we just read here, and Jesus says, whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of judgment. What's he talking about? I think he's talking about Deuteronomy 19. You've heard, don't just kill him. It doesn't matter if you hate him, you curse him, you call them fools, and you do all that. Don't worry about that. That's what the scribes and Pharisees were teaching. You're going to be held liable for anything because, you had that hatred against them. Jesus says, you're going to be judged. You're being judged because you have that hatred already. Don't think yourself wise that you're going to just get away with this. So he's saying, be very careful about this. Deal with the hatred in your heart towards your enemy. I think he's setting the standard right here of the righteousness of God's law. And this is consistent throughout the Bible. Don't hate your neighbor. And if you do, he says you're in great, great danger. So here's the question for us. Is there anybody here this morning that you're hating? In other words, is there anybody there that you're in bitterness towards, you're angry with? Then I'm pleading with you to deal with it based on this text and what Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. You're in danger. Now, the example of homicide, accidental homicide, given in verse 5. Other examples are given in Numbers 35, 22 to 23. We've read this, but let's read it again. It's when a man goes into the woods with his neighbor to hew wood, and his hand takes a stroke with an axe to cut down a tree, a lawful act, a lawful instrument is being applied properly, but lo and behold, the head of the axe slips from his handle, it flies off, it hits the neighbor who was there with him in the woods, and that man dies. That's the example. Self-evident. The question arises as to the presence of witnesses to that accident here. Were there any witnesses to this accident? Well, it doesn't say there was. In fact, the case outline here suggests that there were no actual witnesses to the incident. It only says that a man and his neighbor went to hew wood. It doesn't say a man and his neighbor and his neighbor. It didn't have 3 or 4 of them going out. So 2 people there. Again, there's no eyewitnesses to the account. So how is innocence or guilt going to be established in this case? Well, if you hated your neighbor in times past and you went into the woods and this happened, there's a legal presumption here that you killed him deliberately. Now, verse 3 talks about another sanctuary that's to be given when it's accidental, as verse 4 defined, and verse 5 illustrates here. It says this, if it is an accidental death, he killed his neighbor ignorantly, unwittingly, without intent, he didn't hate him, he can flee into one of these cities of refuge and live. Which I think is more than just, like I said it this way, maybe I should have said it, he can flee. And I don't think he can flee. I think that the admonition here is he must flee. He's responsible to flee. Because if he doesn't flee, then this is going to be counted as an admission of guilt. And the avenger of blood will not be held liable, as it says in the text. If he finds the man and kills him, the man who did not flee to the city of refuge can be considered legally or criminally fleeing justice. I think that's one example of how you handle this text. It is the innocent man who is going to want to flee to this city of refuge and put himself in the hands of the elders and the judges that he might have his case and be tried. Why? Well, he knows he's innocent. But a man who has killed someone is going to think twice. I mean, I'm talking about killing them in a murderous sense. He's going to think twice about wanting to put himself in the hands of the authorities. And so a lot of times when a person is guilty, they go into hiding. Now, the man who does flee is granted protection. Now, the old term that's used, that we think of, is sanctuary. It's a legal term. And it's an interesting history. I mean, even the Greeks used this kind of language. It was misused by the Greeks, where any criminal, guilty, they could be really guilty of a crime. They could go to the temples of the gods, and they couldn't be arrested while they were there. And they were safe from all prosecution, no matter what their guilt or their crime was. But the word sanctuary, as we use it today, refers to a place of protection on the basis of the fact that fugitives were immune from arrest in churches. And that may be, I think that's where, some churches are called sanctuaries. We're going to go to the sanctuary today. Where did that word come from? I think it comes from this idea that in the past, the church was a place where a person could flee until his trial was ready to come up. The church was a place of protection. Maybe that's some way to attempt to apply this law of the cities of refuge. I don't know. But it's a place you could flee for protection. It's an interim between the incident and your trial. But understand this, the protection was only temporary. You flee to the city after the act is committed, because in that city the trial would take place. If you turn back to Numbers 35, verse 24, 25, you say, okay, well, he's fled. And picking up in the context that the slayer has fled to the city of refuge, it says, then the congregation shall judge between the slayer and the avenger of blood according to these judgments. And the congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the avenger of blood. And the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whither he has fled, and he shall abide in it until the death of the high priest, which was anointed with holy oil. And so they're going to judge between the claim of the avenger of blood and the slayer, whether it was accidental or deliberate, if it was reckless or not. They're going to decide that case. And so when they come to the city there, they're not just going to be saved from prosecution forever, but what they're going to be doing is they're going to be provided protection. And the setting there is for a legal, proper trial to take its course. Why would this be the case? Well, you did it this way because human passion and bloodlust, God is saying, I do not want that to rule in Israel. Right? So if someone kills someone you knew, you become highly passionate. And you're ready to take someone else's life. And God say, I don't want vigilante justice. This is not how I want it done. And so they were to flee to the city there. Then a trial would be held to determine guilt or innocence. They are found innocent. They were granted permanent sanctuary within the city, but they must remain in the city, it says, until when? The death of the high priest. But if that person who fled there was found guilty, they're going to be executed. And we'll see that in verses 11 to 13. Let's go back. Deuteronomy 19, verse 6 continues the discussion here about accidental homicide by saying why we need these cities of refuge. Moses says to prevent the unlawful death of someone who killed someone accidentally. And the key phrase there in verse 6 is the avenger of blood. Lest the avenger of blood pursue the slayer, the manslayer, while his heart is hot. Now the verb here, avenger, so who is this avenger of blood? There's a lot of discussion around it, but I think in the original you can kind of get a sense of this. The avenger of blood is one, the verb avenger comes from the word that means redeem, goel. You've probably heard that, goel. You may have heard of Christ as the goel, the redeemer. It means to redeem back, to buy back. But when it's used with the word blood, it has a special sense. It means to require the blood, to avenge the bloodshed by requiring the penalty established by the law for that bloodshed. So who is this avenger of blood? I think it's an important question. And certainly it's a subject under debate. The traditional and most prevalent view is that it was the nearest male kinsman. Now what do I mean by kinsman? I mean a male family member. The nearest male kinsman was Well, it's the nearest kinsman of the deceased, and it's his responsibility to make sure justice is applied to the manslayer. See, the family had both the right and responsibility to see that a murderer pays for his crime. Now, a more recent view of this avenger of blood it teaches that it's not a representative of the family, but of the community. In other words, the avenger of blood is an elected official whose responsibility it was to see all homicides were investigated and prosecuted and avenged if they were found guilty. That would be like, the way they're describing this, it'd be very much like a district attorney who prosecutes crimes. But it's someone the community elects who is responsible to see that when someone is killed, that the death is investigated, the murderer is investigated, and if they believe it was true murder, then that person is prosecuted and avenged. Now, there is an alternative to both of these views, and it combines them. In other words, the avenger of blood is a representative of the family of the dead man, the first view, who's acting on behalf of the family, but he's also acting under the authority of the judges. In other words, he's not his own. He's not just to do whatever he wants to. He's not to act however he wants to freely. In other words, he's a representative of the authority of the judges. He acts on behalf of the family, but he also acts under the authority of the elders and the judges who are there to make sure the death will be fully investigated and the murderer will be prosecuted properly if he's found guilty. So this individual would have the right of execution if that man is found guilty. This man's duty was to bring the killer to justice, is another way to look at it, and make sure that the trial was properly carried out within the court. So, I think he could function as a family member, but he wasn't under the direction of just the family. There's a government aspect because we see in Romans 13, it's the civil realm to carry the sword. So I think you bring the two together, and there's some aspects of both of them under this. Well, if you have more questions about it, maybe we can talk about it later on. But the idea would to bring this person to justice, but his heart could be hot. The reason why I think it's not just an elected official that's separate from the family is because the way this was described here. The idea is that this avenger of blood is going after the slayer, but it's hot. His heart is hot, very personal involvement. He's inflamed with passion, perhaps anger and rage, and he's desiring vengeance, which is normal, but it's not righteous. But it might be a normal desire of the human heart in such a circumstance, but it's not righteous. And the nature of the emotion spoken here seems to indicate that it's someone they knew and loved. And so I think that supports the view that it was a near kinsman, but he was not the avenger of blood like we think of the ancient Near East, where you had basically blood feuds, where there was no civil government involved. It was just a practice that if anyone in your family was killed, you had to designate someone to go and be the avenger of that blood. And you could see how these feuds go on and on and on. I don't think God is supporting that with this text here. I think He's trying to prevent that here. Okay? Notice too, it says, while his heart is hot, that he actually comes upon the man and slays him who is not worthy of death, with someone who has killed someone innocently or unwittingly is not worthy of death according to the Bible. It's not culpable homicide. And as we look at this, we learn that God does not want human passions to rule in society, but justice. Even in the most difficult circumstances that would excite the highest human passion when someone kills another person, passions are not to rule. Rather sober, deliberate men, exercising judicial proceedings and procedures. That's the only standard by which to deal with homicide, and it must be just. Now, having looked at the case of the accidental homicide, let's conclude by looking at the case of the deliberate homicide. This is the second form covered in this section. And we've learned that these cities of refuge were a sanctuary and a permanent place of protection for the individual who accidentally kills his neighbor, as described in verses 4 through 6. But now we see another type of homicide wherein the cities of refuge, though they may provide a place of trial, cannot provide sanctuary after the trial is done. And it's been decided that this was a murder. The definition of deliberate homicide is really fascinating to me. It says, but if any man hates his neighbor and lie in wait for him and rise up against him and smite him mortally, that he dies and flees to one of the cities, then the elders of the city shall send and fetch him thence to deliver him to the hand of the avenger of blood, that he may die. Now notice this. This is a case law. We see the if-then construction. If this happens, then this is what you do. But in setting forth the case of murder, it gives the definition of murder. a biblical definition. And there's three aspects given here. Number one, hatred. Number two, intent to kill. And number three, the use of deadly force. All these come together to make homicide criminal. It's deliberate. There's hatred. There's intent to kill. There's the use of deadly force. All these things come together. See that he who hates his neighbor lies in wait for him, and there's the intent, and he rises and he smites him mortally. Deadly force. All these three ingredients make murder according to the law of God. Now it says, if he hates his neighbor. Now this is the same word that was used in verse 4. We've turned the tables. In verse 4, they didn't hate the neighbor, but now in this one they do. Notice there's three words missing here that we saw in the previous verse back in chapter 19. When he says, this whom he hated not in the past, in time past. That's missing here. I think that's important. Here it says, if any man hates his neighbor. What's missing in time past? It's missing, it's not present, because the hate here could be rage in the moment. We hear these stories of road rage. And those kinds of things here, they happen all of a sudden. Someone cuts the person off. There's road rage. No association in the past with one another. But they're raging at that moment. They kill the person. Well, that applies here. It doesn't, you can't go into court and say, look, I've never met this person. I've never hated them in the past. And then that gets you off the hook. No, there's hatred there in the moment. Murder is always the result of hatred in the heart. There is rage. This is why it's so important to get your anger under control, right? Rage and anger always cause you to act. Maybe you don't go all the way to killing someone, but boy, it can cause you to assault someone. It can cause all kinds of things. It can cause you to say things that normally you wouldn't say. So if you have a problem with anger and rage and controlling yourself, you need to take that before God, because that all comes into account in a case of homicide. But murder always involves the hatred of another human being. Every murder that's ever been committed was because of hatred. Because it's the passion that's ruling the heart of the killer. Listen to this classic legal definition of murder. Maybe you've heard this before. Black's Law Dictionary says again, the unlawful killing of a human being by another with what? Malice. Exactly what the passage is saying here. It's the same word for hate. With malice aforethought, either expressed or implied. In other words, that hatred, that malice that was before the actual act, that thought that led to the act was malice. It doesn't have to be expressed in just one kind of way. It could be expressed by cursings, horrible words, gestures. It only needs to be implied. And so the idea there is anybody who murders another person is filled with malice. That fits biblical law. The second thing here is that he lies in wait for him. This speaks to premeditation with the intent to kill. Now this premeditation doesn't involve necessarily plotting the death. To lie in wait doesn't mean that he sat there for 3 hours to plot or for 3 months. To lie in wait in the text there means the person has deliberately chosen to kill another person. His lying in wait could just be in matters of moment. But it's bringing apart the idea of deliberation. The deliberation may be very hasty, but it's a definite act. Nobody kills anybody, murders anybody, strikes them, as we're going to see in the next one, with deadly force who doesn't want it. Again, the legal definition today reflects this biblical definition. Criminal homicide constitutes murder A, when it's committed purposely and knowingly, and B, is committed recklessly under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life. So criminal homicide is what we're talking about here. It's deliberate. It's deliberate murder because it's committed purposely and knowingly, or it's committed in a reckless way that shows extreme indifference to the value of human life. And then the third factor that's in this definition here says it rises up against him, smites him mortally, that he die. In other words, there is a deliberate use of deadly force. And this would, cover all forms of assault that would involve a weapon, a gun, sword, knife, a club, any of these things that can be grabbed at the moment and used as a deadly instrument. For example, in Numbers 35, it talks about a rock, a stick, an article, or an instrument that's when used against a person that could cause their death. Whenever there's a use of force, whenever there's the use of a weapon, there's bodily assault. And here's the thing. It doesn't really matter if the murderer says, well, I didn't intend to kill him. I just wanted to give him a good knock on the head to teach him a lesson. No. If you smite him mortally in the sense of deadly force and that person dies, it doesn't matter that you intended that or not. You're a murderer. And then if you want to use the second part of the legal definition, extreme indifference to the value of human life, the fact that you would hit them with a foreign object tells someone that you have extreme indifference towards that human life. Again, listen to the legal definition. And notice how consistent it is with biblical law. George Rush says in his Dictionary of Criminal Justice that murder is intentionally causing the death of another without legal justification or excuse, or causing the death of another while committing or attempting to commit another crime. And Black says, criminal homicide constitutes murder when it's committed purposely or knowingly, or is committed recklessly under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life. And I'm going to continue to quote, which I broke off earlier. Such recklessness and indifference are presumed if the actor is engaged or is an accomplice in the commission of, or an attempt to commit, or flight after committing, or an attempting to commit robbery, rape, force, or threat of force, arson, burglary, kidnapping, or felonious escape. You're involved in a robbery, and someone is killed in that robbery. You can't say, I was just there to rob. I didn't intend to kill anybody. But the very fact that you rise up against your neighbor, invade his property, to take his property, you rose up against your neighbor here in this scenario, even if, the person's fighting you off to keep you from robbing them, if you killed them, that's murder. You can't say that I came just to rob. I didn't intend to murder anybody. If he'd have just let me rob him, and if he wouldn't have fought back, doesn't matter. Do you see the case law that's given there, the legal definitions, and how that all finds support right here? Well, what should happen in this case? Well, the person's to be prosecuted. Verse 12 says in Deuteronomy 12, then the elders of the city shall send him and fetch him. Deuteronomy 19 here. You shall send him, fetch him, deliver him to the hand of the avenger of blood that he may die. That's the standard. And remember, when we looked at Deuteronomy 17, 4 through 13, we looked at the standards of capital trials. And I don't have time to go back and review all that. But just remember, there must be a careful consideration of the facts. There must be a credible testimony and witnesses that clearly establish guilt. All of that has to happen. And what this text assumes is that did happen. The man found guilty of murder, he was turned over to the avenger of blood. And the avenger of blood here is clearly the executioner. And we see the punishment now for deliberate homicide at the end of this text. And the thing I find interesting here is that there's no mention of how the man should be put to death. A lot of the capital crimes in the Old Testament tells you how they should be put to death. But here it doesn't. A lot of times it was stoning someone. We saw that, for example, in idolatry in chapter 17. But there's no statement here of how they're to be put to death. Furthermore, there's no statement of the community involving themselves in the execution like it did in the other text, where the men of the city would gather and would stone the man. All it says here is they're put to death in the hand of the avenger of blood that he may die, indicating that his death is under the control or direction of the avenger of blood, who again I think is a family member representing the family and avenging the precious blood of their loved one. Now, when you live in wicked times when people's immediate affection is towards the murderer and not the victim. But God's law is weighted towards the victim. And that's why the law of God is written the way it is. But in the Bible, murder is a capital crime from beginning to end, beginning with Genesis 9 that we read earlier, and Exodus 21, 12 to 14, which mirrors this passage. It says, he that smites a man, so he shall die and surely be put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God delivers him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee, that is the city of refuge. And that's an interesting commentary on an accidental death. God in His providence caused this thing to happen, is what Exodus is talking about. It wasn't the fault of the man. For some reason, God had the accidental death come to pass. But then it says, if the man came presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, there's hatred, thou shalt take him from the altar that he may die. Now that's interesting when he says in Exodus he may take him from the altar. What's he talking about? Well, remember in Exodus they were in the wilderness and they had the tabernacle and there would have been an altar there. There was no city of refuge in the wilderness. So where could someone who accidentally killed somebody, where could he go? Well, he would go to the altar, and that's where he'd find refuge, sanctuary, till this trial could happen. And so that was when you go into the land, that same provision is given, but through these cities of refuge. Now, another point, the manner of death, as I said, is not specified here or really in the Scriptures. Jewish law, which is not inspired, murderers are put to death with a sword. But I think lex talionis, that's Latin for retribution. If you go and look up this term, a lot of this it's going to sound harsh to you, but murder is a reality and it must be punished so that the fear of God fills the heart of everyone who will tremble in their boots. If they hate of someone, if you hate someone, you repent of it, you turn from that, that would be good. Because if you go to the point of actually deliberately killing through endangerment or recklessly endangering the life of someone else, this idea of lex talionis says, however you kill someone, that's how you're going to die. The avenger of blood, if the person died by a sword, the avenger of blood would put him to death with a sword. If he strangled the victim, I understand it's not pleasant, but that's how the man would die, through strangulation. That would send a signal to the culture that we take life seriously. And you're not just out here taking human life willy-nilly like we are today. In today's day, if he was killed by a knife, he'd be killed by a knife. Today's world, if he was killed by a gun, he'd be, if he murdered someone with a gun, he'd be killed by a gun. Fearful stuff. But murder is all around us because there's no fear. There's no fear of God in this land anymore. And it seems to me that the avenger of blood, there again, we could talk about this at lunch, but it seems to me the avenger of blood could choose the method of execution and have it carried out. Notice here it says, your eye shall not pity him. No mercy or pity should be shown to the murderer. I believe that's in a judicial sense. And I want you to understand this. We have so many people today saying, we should have mercy and compassion on these murderers. That's not the role of the civil realm. The role of the civil realm is to execute justice. Now, when I say I believe this does not have mercy or pity in a judicial sense, what I mean by that, he's going to have to die for his crime. There's a penalty prescribed for his crime. But I don't think that means there's no pity for his soul. Now, what I mean by that is somebody getting ready to die for a capital crime, there's nothing wrong with a pastor going to them and pleading with them, get ready before you see your Maker. I think that's all fine to do. In fact, when we see Jesus upon the cross and it says he was between these robbers, we think of petty thieves. That's not why those guys were hanging on the cross. These were bands of robbers who would actually go and murder people on the highways and byways. And so that's why they were being, crucified. But one did repent before he died. One did come to a sense of who Jesus Christ was. All right. The purpose of punishing deliberate homicide, murder, you do this, why? So you shall put away innocent blood. Human blood pollutes the land. It pollutes and it stains the land. What did God say after Cain killed Abel? His blood cries to me from the ground, and it's open to receive his blood. The land was polluted for the first time with human blood. It opened up. It received his blood. He soaked it in. In other words, when I say polluted, I'm saying it's morally polluted. And when anyone is killed or murdered, in terms of that death, that society should punish the murderer, because if that blood goes unanswered and is not avenged for, it morally pollutes the land. And we're going to look more about this in Deuteronomy 21 when we get there. But it would be good for our society to come back to these principles and apply them again. If you indoctrinate children from a young age that they're a cosmic accident, products of evolution, they're advanced orangutans, whatever it is, their nonsense they're teaching, then you send them out to more advanced teaching in universities to get more of that indoctrination in, it really degrades the value of human life. And what has not been brought to the forefront, again, is this idea of, no, it's actually worthy of protection because it's an image bearer of God. And our laws should support that. It should go back to Genesis 9 and look at this and say the reason why you should take someone who has killed someone, murdered someone, is because they were created in the image of God. Another thing, real quickly, let me just say this and let me try to bring this to an end. Notice here there's no appeals. It's not allowed. I mean, in Deuteronomy 17, we saw there's a high court, but that was not to appeal a conviction, such as a murder trial, but basically it was to take a trial that was too difficult for them at the local judges to handle. And we see here again, separations of powers. We learn here that the ultimate power of the sword belongs to the state and not the family. So the avenger of blood was under law. He was the one who brought the fugitive to justice so they could have a trial. And if he is guilty, then the avenger of blood under the civil realm was to carry out his duty. He was a prosecutor, but he was not a vigilante. Again, the Bible's against all forms of vigilante justice. All right, let me just stop here. I hope you begin to sense something of the seriousness of what God looks at shedding innocent blood. I hope you begin to get a grasp of what it means to have justice in the land. This is why God went through all this to establish these cities so that justice would be established in the land. So because justice is important to God, it's got to be important to us. And then the final thing I would say is don't disconnect this idea of hate and murder. And again, if you have a grudge, murder in your heart towards someone, be very, very careful with that. If you're given and prone to fits of rage, be very, very careful with that because we can see it can end up and those fits of rage can be used against you in a court of law. Let's pray. Father, we thank you again for this word, these teachings. May it help expose any area of our lives where we're harboring bitterness and uncontrolled rage towards someone. Lord, may we get that under control. Lord, may anger, rage, a vengeful spirit may be replaced with the fruits of the Spirit. And so, Father, may we not be guilty of these things. May we walk sober-minded among these things. Also, may we also go and continue to show the wickedness of our civil realm that has harbored hatred in their hearts to innocent babies. They've legalized this thing. May you use us to remind our judges that murderers should not be given mercy, but they should be given justice. And so, Father, we just pray that justice would rule in this land again, that there might be a proper fear of you, and that wickedness may be restrained within this land once again. So we plead for wisdom. We ask you to continue to help instruct and guide our minds about these truths that are important to you. Because they're important to you, make them important to us. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.